former leadership, its founder, Robert Morris, and even his wife. It accuses them of defaming Cindy Clemenshire and causing her emotional distress.
When millions in donations disappear into institutional machinery and the people who handed over their faith discover they were handed a lie instead, the pastor holding the microphone rarely admits what his spreadsheets already prove. There is a particular kind of secret that lives inside filing cabinets and databases, waiting silently across years, until one moment arrives when someone finally refuses to stay complicit. That moment, when it comes, always carries documentation attached to it. And when those documents see daylight, they speak in a language that nobody can pretend to misunderstand. Numbers don't lie, but people do. Tonight, that story belongs to a congregation in Texas, a megachurch with over 100,000 members across multiple campuses, an institution that built its reputation on promises made from behind a microphone every Sunday morning, and a system that designed its internal structures specifically to make certain those promises would never be tested. On October 4, 2024, a lawsuit was filed in a Texas courtroom that would force open what institutional power had worked for years to keep sealed. 4 congregants walked into that courthouse with one clear message: "We believed you. We gave you our money, and you lied about where it went." The promise written into the pulpit for years, the senior leadership of this megachurch made a specific and repeated promise to every single person sitting in its pews. They said that when you gave a tithe, when you handed over 10% or more of your income, as an act of worship and obedience, the church had a specific allocation system in place. They said that out of every dollar you donated, 15% would be routed directly to international missionary work. 15% would feed the hungry across borders. 15% would build schools and clinics in developing nations. 15% would extend the church's spiritual reach into places where most Americans would never travel. This was not a vague aspiration. This was not a hopeful goal. This was presented as a binding covenant. The pastor described it from the pulpit as a guarantee. He told congregants, "If you're ever unhappy with how we're using this 15%, if you ever doubt that we're honoring this commitment, come to us and we will return your tithe. We will give your money to a charity that deserves it." We stand behind this promise completely. For families living paycheck to paycheck, for single mothers working 2 jobs, for retirees on fixed incomes, this promise was not hypothetical. It was the difference between giving reluctantly and giving sacrificially. It was the thing that made them believe their money was mattering for eternity, not just filling an institutional budget. But in 2011, something happened inside that church that nobody in the congregation was supposed to discover. The church hired a professional, a certified public accountant with years of experience in nonprofit finance, and gave him a specific mandate: run the global ministries division, maintain its financial integrity, reconcile every dollar that comes in and every dollar that goes out, make certain that what the church promises from the pulpit actually matches what the church does with the money. For 4 years, this accountant performed exactly that job. He reviewed statements. He tracked transfers. He watched the flow of millions of dollars moving through accounts designated for international work. He was thorough. He was professional. He was doing what he had been hired to do. And then he found something that changed everything. The gap that refused to close when a CPA reconciles financial accounts. They are looking for one thing: alignment. Does what the organization told people would happen actually match what the records show did happen? In this case, the accountant was comparing 2 things. First, the amount of money the church had publicly stated in sermons, in newsletters, in official statements was being sent overseas to international ministries. Second, the actual dollar amounts he could document leaving the designated global ministries accounts and arriving in partner organizations overseas. The numbers did not align. What he discovered was a discrepancy running into the millions. The gap between the promised 15% and the documented 15% was so significant, so persistent across multiple years, that it could not possibly be explained by accounting error or timing delays. This was not a rounding problem, this was a structural problem. This was evidence that what the church had told its members week after week from the pulpit was not actually happening. The accountant understood what he was looking at, he understood the implications, he also understood that he could not simply ignore it and move forward with his job. Professional ethics demanded that he raise this issue with his supervisors. Moral conscience demanded it. And the mandate he had been given, maintain financial integrity, demanded it. He approached a church executive, a man who held significant power within the organization's leadership structure, and he laid out what the numbers showed. He presented the discrepancy. He documented the gap between promised and actual disbursements. He made it clear that he believed this needed to be addressed. The response he received was not a commitment to investigate. It was not a proposal to correct the problem or inform the congregation. It was something far simpler and far more revealing. He was told to stop reconciling the accounts. Let me repeat that, because these 4 words contain the entire architecture of institutional failure. A man hired to maintain financial integrity was instructed to stop maintaining financial integrity. A professional brought on to reconcile accounts was told that reconciliation itself was the problem. When someone in institutional power tells you to stop asking questions about where the money goes, they are communicating something very clearly. The money's location matters less to them than the money's location staying hidden. The accountant refused. He would not simply shelve his findings and pretend the discrepancy did not exist. Instead, he escalated the situation. He approached a second executive pastor, a man named Tom Lane, and he said something that constitutes an act of extraordinary moral courage inside an institutional power structure. Either these discrepancies get reconciled and transparent, brought before the congregation with full accountability, or I will resign and take my findings to the media. He had drawn his line. He had made it clear that his professional integrity and his moral conscience could not survive inside a system designed to hide financial truth. The institutional response, what happened next, is the moment where institutional power revealed its true nature. The accountant did not receive a commitment to reform. He did not receive gratitude for his ethical stand. He did not receive support from leadership for attempting to restore transparency. Instead, the church accepted his resignation. More than that, they moved with speed to remove him from the staff directory, to scrub his contact information from systems, to ensure that no congregant wondering about where their tithes actually went could reach him and ask. The message was unmistakable to anyone else working inside the organization. If you raise questions about how money moves through this institution, if you insist on transparency when leadership prefers opacity, your tenure here will end swiftly. Years passed. The accountant moved on. He found work elsewhere, rebuilt his career, and carried forward with his life. But the documentation he had created the reconciliation reports, the spreadsheets showing the gap between promised and actual, the emails describing what he had discovered. That documentation remained inside the church's systems. Nobody on the congregation side of the pulpit knew any of this had happened. Nobody knew that their financial promises had been questioned internally. Nobody knew that a professional had refused to be complicit in what he had witnessed and that his refusal had cost him his job. The church's leadership continued to preach about global missions every Sunday. They continued to praise congregants for their generous giving. They continued to promise that 15% was going where they said it was going. But inside the filing cabinets, the numbers told a different story. The congregation begins to ask in 2024, more than a decade after the accountant had left his position, something began to shift inside the congregation. Members started asking questions. Specifically, they asked their church leadership to produce financial documentation showing exactly how much had been collected for international ministries and where those funds had actually been dispersed. They asked for the kind of transparency that the church had promised from the pulpit. What they received in response was not transparency. It was silence. The church did not provide comprehensive financial records. The church did not detail the discrepancies. The church did not explain where the billions in tithes collected over decades had gone. Instead, the church offered deflection. When congregants pressed further, they were given generic statements about administrative procedures. When they requested specific numbers, they were told those records were not available in the format being requested. When they asked to speak with financial officers, they were directed to staff members who had been explicitly instructed not to answer detailed questions. One congregant, a woman named Catherine Leach, made a specific request. She asked the church to honor the promise that the senior pastor had made repeatedly from the pulpit, that any member who was unhappy with how their tithe was being used could request a refund, and that refund would be processed and their money donated to a charity of their choosing. She made that request believing the promise was real. What she discovered was that the promise only existed in sermon recordings, not in actual church policy. When she pressed the issue, attempting to utilize what had been presented as a guarantee, the church informed her that no such refund policy actually existed. She had been told something from the pulpit that was not true. She had been taught to believe in an institutional promise that the institution had never actually intended to honor. That specific moment, when a congregant realized they had been deliberately misled, became the fulcrum point on which an entire lawsuit would eventually turn. The decision to fight back three other congregants, Gary Leach, Mark Browder, and Terry Browder, had experienced similar treatment. They had all asked for the same transparency. They had all been rebuffed. They had all discovered that the financial promises made to them from behind the pulpit had no actual backing in the church's operational reality. Together, they made a decision that would force the issue into the open. They hired an attorney and filed a class action lawsuit against the megachurch. The lawsuit alleged that the church had engaged in financial fraud. It alleged that church leadership had knowingly made promises about tithe allocation that they were not honoring. It alleged that when internal staff had attempted to enforce accountability, when the accountant had insisted on reconciliation, they had been removed from their position. It alleged that when congregants had requested the transparency promised from the pulpit, they had been denied access to the church's financial records. The suit was filed on behalf of the four named congregants and potentially tens of thousands of unnamed congregants who had given tithes during the period in question, believing their money was being allocated as promised. Members in Wyoming, members in Missouri, members in Colorado, members in Texas. Anyone who had ever heard the 15% promise from that pulpit and had made a financial decision based on that promise could potentially be part of the class. The damages being sought exceeded $1 million in compensatory relief. But legal experts analyzing the case believed that the actual damages, if the full scope of the financial discrepancy was calculated and applied across all affected members and all years involved, could run into tens of millions. More importantly, the lawsuit contained something the church's leadership had not anticipated: documentation. The documents emerged during the initial discovery phase of the lawsuit. Attorneys for the congregants began requesting internal church documents. They requested financial statements from the Global Ministries Division. They requested communications between church executives discussing the gap between promised and actual disbursements. They requested records related to the departure of the CPA who had discovered the discrepancy. And they received them. The documents told a story that nobody inside the church had successfully hidden, even though they had tried. They showed that church leadership had been aware of the financial discrepancies. They showed that leadership had discussed the gap repeatedly in internal communications. They showed that when one staff member attempted to address the problem professionally, he had been pressured to resign. One particularly damaging email came from Tom Lane, the executive pastor who had been told by the accountant that either transparency or resignation would be the outcome. In that email, written in 2011, Lane documented that he had met with the accountant and understood the scope of the financial problem. He also documented that senior leadership had instructed him to accept the accountant's resignation rather than address the underlying issue. The email contained this sentence: "Rather than practice transparent stewardship with one of our key staff members, who was hired specifically to lead this division and ensure its integrity, the church chose to accept his resignation instead of investigating and correcting the underlying problem. That sentence, written by a church executive and discovered during discovery, essentially admitted to institutional cover-up. It documented not merely an oversight, but a deliberate choice to eliminate the person raising the alarm rather than address the alarm's validity. Why this story matters beyond one institution, the reason this lawsuit matters is not simply about recouping money for defrauded congregants, although that matters. It is about what happens when people commit themselves spiritually and financially to an institution that they believe shares their values, and that institution responds to scrutiny not with reform, but with opacity and power assertion. For decades, the evangelical movement in America has been built, in significant part, on the strength of personal relationships with charismatic leaders standing behind pulpits. Members are taught that giving is an act of worship, not a transaction. Members are taught that faith requires trust in those who stand in positions of spiritual authority. Members are taught that questioning leadership is, itself, a form of spiritual weakness. But trust cannot survive indefinitely when those in authority repeatedly ask members to trust them with their resources, while simultaneously hiding how those resources are actually being deployed. Trust cannot survive when the institution responds to legitimate questions about financial stewardship by pressuring the questioners into silence or departure. The megachurch in this story had survived previous scandals. It had weathered public criticism. It had seen pastors resign and institutions rebuild. But the crisis it now faces is structurally different because it comes directly from its own members, the very people the institution trained to trust it completely. They gave in good faith. They were promised specific stewardship. They discovered that promise was built on a financial architecture specifically designed to obscure the truth. The ongoing reckoning as of now, the lawsuit remains in the discovery and depositions phase, heading toward what legal experts predict will be years of testimony, document review, and negotiations. The church's leadership has released only minimal public statements addressing the allegations. No comprehensive financial audit has been made public that would allow members to understand exactly where all the international ministry funds went over the years in question. Inside that church, there are likely dozens of current and former staff members who know far more than they are saying publicly. There are probably several who, like the accountant years ago, have been faced with an agonizing choice: speak up and risk their career, or stay silent and maintain their employment. The central question now becomes, what does institutional repentance actually look like when an entire organizational structure has been built specifically to avoid it? The answer to that question will be determined not just by lawyers and judges, but by whether the congregants, the people who gave their money in good faith, decide to demand it, or whether they simply move on to other churches and other institutions. The larger pattern this story is not isolated. Over the past decade, major evangelical institutions have faced repeated accountability crises, leadership scandals, financial mismanagement, institutional cover-ups. In case after case, the pattern has been remarkably similar. A crisis emerges, leadership initially denies. Documentation eventually surfaces, and the community is left wondering how an institution built on principles of transparency and accountability became so sophisticated at hiding the truth. The difference in this case is that the congregants refused to be managed into silence. They did not accept the church's deflections and denials. They did not allow institutional power to bully them into complacency. They hired attorneys and filed suit based on what they could prove. And in doing so, they forced the institution to either change or face a reckoning in court with documents and witnesses and testimony under oath. Your role in this ongoing story, if you've been following this story from the beginning, or if you've experienced something similar at your own place of worship, I want to hear from you. Like this video and make sure you subscribe to Church Files Daily for more investigative reporting on accountability failures inside religious institutions. The truth has a way of finding daylight, even when an entire system is designed to keep it in darkness. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you experienced a situation where institutional promises failed to match institutional reality? What would it take for you to trust that institution again? The work of holding institutions accountable is not the job of journalists alone. It is the responsibility of every person who has ever been harmed by the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. When you speak up, when you share your story, when you refuse to be silenced by institutional power, you create space for the next person to do the same. Thank you for watching and for caring about this story.